with simple bits of data that really can be stored for each block in one flat database table. It's pretty easy. Um, Building a block is pretty easy, and I don't want to get too far ahead of that of the kind of simple blocks that we're working with. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free, because otherwise I might be coming close to the end of it. If you have any specific things that you'd like to see that are a little more on the basic side of things rather than the advanced side of things, even if it's stuff we've already covered um, that you'd just like to continue seeing further examples of, I would be happy to show you. Tom asks, could you show examples of some stuff like checkboxes and radio buttons in edit.php? I assume it automatically checks them if checked before by detecting a 1 in the database. Yeah, I could definitely do that. That's a good example. That's a good question. Um, let's yeah, let's go through actually. That's a good question. Let's go through my custom block that I added to our project. And I will actually go through the process of adding a checkbox type field to this block. So let's go back to the home page. Actually, first thing I'm going to do is, and this is actually a good thing to remember, is when you're working on new blocks and working on blocks on your site, it's a good idea usually to disable caching on your site, just so that because sometimes certain things about blocks are saved in the cache for performance reasons, and if you're making changes to that block, you may want to, it's going to be annoying to have to clear that cache all the time, or wonder why your changes aren't saving. So here's my sidebar contact information block. Let's say I want to add a checkbox to this that says this person is a supervisor, and then I wanted to actually show some custom CSS, or I wanted to do something to this. I wanted to do something to this to denote if they were, a supervisor. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a few different things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add this to my db.xml. I'm going to add a new field, and I'm going to call it supervisor. Actually, I'm going to call it is supervisor, and I'm going to give this a function, or I'm going to call it I1, which is all that means is a tiny int, so 1 or 0, basically. And I'm going to give it a default value of 0. And again, you wouldn't know all the syntax by yourself. You'd have to learn the this special AXMLS syntax. So I've added this to the block, and what I can do now is I could uninstall the block and reinstall it, but that would delete all instances of it in the site that I'm using, which might not be that desired. So what I'm going to do instead is jump to the block type section and click on sidebar contact information and click refresh. And now it says block type refreshed. Any database schema changes have been applied. So now if I describe BT queue and contact information, I have a new column in there called is supervisor, and its default value is 0. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this form, and I'm going to add a checkbox. And I'm going to write this stuff in just regular HTML so it's easier for people to read. Again, notice that I'm labeling everything with the proper name. It has to match my column name. I'm going to give it a 1 by default. And that's all I'm going to do at first. I know it's not completely finished yet because it's not going to handle edits yet, but I will do one thing at a time. Is supervisor. Now if I click and add this, I've added my block. It's showing up in there. I'm not doing anything with that supervisor stuff yet, but let's say I wanted to. First off, let's make sure that it actually got in to the database correctly. You can see that if I do a select statement from my database table, I have is supervisor set to 1. So that's getting in there correctly. Now, what I want to do is I want to add a CSS file that automatically gets included here. I'm not going to put anything in it yet. Let's say I want to do something with this supervisor information. I've got sidebar contact information. Let's add a little something. If is supervisor, it's going to be 1 or 0. I'm going to add in sidebar contact information supervisor. So this is a new class. And again, much like everything else, is supervisor is going to be either 1 or 0, depending on what was actually saved. And I don't have to set anything. Since it's part of the block's record in that database table, it's going to automatically be set in here. And now, if I do this, I can add in a custom class. Background color. Let's add in some kind of subtle gray. And now if I refresh my page, okay, so now it's time to do a little debugging to see why this may not be taking effect. So first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my class actually is getting it correctly. So sidebar contact information. As you can see here, my supervisor is not actually showing up correctly. So I'm going to double check that the right information is showing up here. I'm going to double check that the templates are in fact updating. Okay. Apparently there was some sort of delayed cache thing going on because now it's working. See, that's going to happen sometimes. So now you can see if I add a copy of this sidebar block where the person is not a supervisor, it shows up without the gray background. But if I add one where they are, it shows up with the gray background. And finally, if I edit this, you can see that the checkbox is actually unchecked. That's because I haven't put in the correct logic to check it. So if I head back into my form.php, you can see I need to add in checked here somewhere. So as you might imagine, that's just as simple as doing this. So if I click this, it's unchecked, but if I click this one, it is checked. And if I save it, oh, interesting. And you can see that my supervisor is not actually saving correctly. So this, let's try to figure out why that might be. All right, we're going to try something here. Okay, so we've encountered some kind of strange behavior that you might classify as a bug in concrete5, although there's probably a reason for why this is happening. What was going on here is when I'm saving this, it's saving fine the first time if it's got a 1. However, before, if I didn't include this save function, since I've unchecked this and it's a completely blank, I think I know actually what's going on here. In concrete5, when we save the block, this is just kind of an interesting tidbit. When we're saving the block, we're looping through the post to determine which fields are being sent in to be saved. And in HTML, when you uncheck a checkbox, it doesn't even include that checkbox in the post. So if you get rid of this function here and you don't include the checkbox, it doesn't even include it in the post, and concrete5 thinks, well, I don't see that. I'm not even going to save that particular record for the block. So unfortunately, what that means is if I uncheck it, it never resets it back from 1 to 0. So what we have to do is define this custom save function here in the contact information block controller, which says, hey, if there's an isSupervisor value in the post, set it to 1. Otherwise, set it to 0. And then send it back in to the parent save function, which will appropriately keep it from being saved or not saved. So, oops, I have to save that again. There we go. Tom asks if we could do the field in edit with something like form checkbox. Yeah, you totally can. This is sort of, if you check out the This is just a whoops. Oh, if you look in the concrete5 developer documentation for the standard widgets in the forms section, you can see how to use the how to use all the different stuff. So checkbox is in here. It is checked is a Boolean which controls whether the checkbox is initially checked or not. So all this stuff is available here, and this is not specific to blocks at all. So any data, and you can feel free to look at the documentation there and use that in the different use that to um, make your life easier in terms of outputting forms. Arlene was wondering if we could do an example of how we might work with or style or just peek at the next previous block, and I will be happy to do that. So the concrete5 blog, I believe, has an example of the next / previous block, although maybe it doesn't. I don't know that this is the best example. Okay, so the next / previous block is a simple way to add a block on a page that lets you, at the end of a page, for example, go to the next page in a sequence or next blog entry or previous one. And it works simply by querying the page you're on, finding that page at the current sitemap node, and finding the previous one and the next one based on your order parameter. So by default, it's sitemap, which is just going to be the order of pages as you've ordered them in the sitemap. But you could also do chronological if you were doing a blog. And it's pretty basic. It's not tremendously attractive, as you can see. You can tell, you can give it the labels. You can, you've got arrows. You can tell whether you should return to the start or end of the sequence, which is, since there's only one page here, clicking next and previous will just keep cycling this page back and forth. But this isn't the most attractive block. So let's take 5 to 10 minutes to clean it up before we're done with the training for today. So if I wanted to clean this block up and make it look a little bit nicer, what I would do first is I would go into next previous, and I would, what I would probably do is I would look at view.php, and I would see, this isn't the worst HTML I've ever seen. I'm just going to copy view.css into my root directory and create next previous and do view.css. And then what I'm going to do is first I'm going to just comment all this out to make sure that it's working. So now you can see the block still works. It's just next the CSS is just no longer in there, which is totally fine. And again, what I'm going to probably do here, now that I think about it, is I'm just going to leave this blank at first. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to copy out view.php, come into next previous and paste it in here. And so now anytime all of the instances of next underscore previous will be using this overridden version of view.php at this point. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the way that it displays these. I'm going to change the way that it displays the next and previous labels, because I don't really like the fact that it hovers at 33%. I think it looks a little strange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this class, since it is the base class that we're using to wrap all of this content, and I'm going to go into my view.css and I'm going to add it in here, and I'm going to give it a position of relative. And then I'm going to give it a text align of center. And this is very much by the seat of my pants, so we will see if this works or not. And then I'm not going to do anything with the parent link, but I'm going to change this from floating left to position absolute, top 0px, left 0px. Position absolute, top 0px, right 0px. So I don't know how familiar you are with CSS, but what I'm trying to do here is I want to create this wrapper and give it a position of relative, and then within that div I want the previous link to be forced to be the left, and I want the next link to be forced to be the right, but I want the up to parent link to be in the middle of the page. And that's sort of what we're trying to do here, but the fact that we're floating them at fixed percents does not look good. So we're going to try this again, and now you can kind of see that actually looks pretty good. Well, I might just have to move this into the core because that looks a lot better. So what you've seen now is I've created a view.css, which I have lost, that works in a different way than before, and we are overriding the previous one. And I'm going to copy this spacer back out just so that it looks good, because there's probably a reason that that was in there. And now, maybe in my custom template, I'm not totally pleased with those arrows. You can see that we've got oh God. As you can see, if we take a look in the next previous block, if we look in the controller, the view function here is responsible for adding the arrows on, which is a little frustrating because it's much easier to change the custom template if all the presentation logic is contained within the template, the view.php file, instead of the view function. But you can see that this show arrows function has been is actually adding this next and previous within the controller. So instead of actually changing the controller, I'm going to instead, I'm going to cheat a little bit by editing this and removing the arrows that are here. And you can see that gets rid of those. And now I'm going to use in my custom template, I'm going to add in some nice arrows to make it look a little bit nicer. If I can find my template again. Here we go. Okay. So here's where we are handling the previous link. I'm going to find a nice little arrow in concrete5. I could have sworn that I had an arrow here. Well, we can use this one as an example. So this isn't showing up for some reason. So I think instead of doing that, maybe I will just simply swap out the arrows for something else that I think looks a little nicer. I wonder why that's not showing up. Ah, probably because I am making the change to the wrong directory. So this is an important lesson. Make sure that you are actually operating from within the overridden template as opposed to the other one, because you will have problems otherwise. Images. So now we've actually added some images to our nav. They're not the nicest images, but it's a nice example of how easy it is to add images to this thing. And I think since they don't look that good, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just another level of customization. I'm going to make the image that's found within the previous section give a margin to the right so that it looks a little better. And I'm going to make the image that's found in the next give a margin to the left. And that gives us a little bit of padding, which is nice. So now you can kind of see we've taken the next previous block and we improved pretty substantially the base CSS that's underneath it, which to the point where we might include that in the next version of concrete5 just because I think it looks nicer. And we've also added some images and made sure that those images kind of look nice with what we're doing. And we've done it without having to fork the core, and we've actually done it without even having to create a custom template. And yeah, so before we close up on this, I'll give a little bit of kind of a refresher on just on what the different files in the in a particular block types directory do, just so that because you can never go too slowly on some of that stuff, because I did go pretty quickly. So I'm going to go through. I'll give a good. I think a good example is the contact information block that that I had before. So just as a basic refresher, we'll just go through each one of these. Add.php is the template that is displayed when you add a block of this type to a page. You can have your own custom form in there. You can include a form that you also include in an edit template like here. But whatever you put in add.php is going to be shown to the user when they add this block to the page. So here we are just including another page, another PHP file within the same blocks directory. And that's what INC does. So, you know, if you've been writing PHP, you're probably pretty familiar with include. This INC is sort of our version of include. It does a few more things. It checks in a couple different spots. It passes some data in that may or may not be available if you just included it using include. It's sort of a shortcut for calling include. You shouldn't use PHP's basic include function. You should use this INC. Edit, much like add, is displayed to the user when you're editing a block. Both add.php and edit.php are optional, although 99% of blocks that you write for a client site are going to have both of those. They could be, you could dispense with form.php and not use it. Instead, just include a blank form in add, and in edit, include the form with the actual block's values found in it. Or you could use the same template for both and include them here. Form.php is named that way because it's a shared form between both add and edit interfaces, but it could be named anything. You'll notice in core blocks for a while we had a we called it well, here we call it page list form. Here we call it here we actually have to add and edit PHP files. In HTML we have form_setup_HTML. You can name what you don't have to name this in a particular way. You just have to make sure that your add and edit templates include it by name here. Moving along. Controller.php is the main script that runs behind the scenes. It sets up the description, the name of the block. It names the database table that's going to store all of its data. It gives the interface width and height for the block. It sets up other options about the block that are a little more advanced than this class, like caching settings and things like that. It also defines any functions that need to be run to process the block's data or need to be run behind the scenes for the block to function properly. So some blocks don't need any functions in here. Some blocks need a save function. If you define a function named view or add or edit, it will be run before that view is rendered to the user. So if you need to run some custom function when you're adding a block, you can define a function named add in this file here, and put that logic there. db.xml is an XML. It's an XML. It's an XML file that uses the AXMLS format. um, that is found in ADODB documentation. Uh, if I go to concrete5.org and go in the how-tos and search the how-tos for DBXML, you can see that we've posted a how-to on how to work with DBXML files, and this was originally published by Lucas Anderson, and it's got a fair amount of information on the types and how this sort of what the purpose of these files are for. Um, and it also links off to the original documentation for this format. So rather than just kind of taking a stab in the dark at what this is, it does a pretty good job of explaining what that format does. Additionally, the block documentation in the core developer documentation should have information on this as well. Like in creating a block type, a lot of this information is found within the creating a block type documentation here in the developer documentation. And that's what db.xml is all about. And this file is automatically parsed, and the database tables that are found in here are automatically created when a block is installed, whether it's installed through a package, whether it's installed whether it's a core block and installed when you first install concrete5, or whether you install it yourself when you're installing a custom block through the dashboard. Icon.png is just a little graphic file, 16 by 16 pixels, wide and tall. It shows up in a list when you're adding the block type to a page. And finally, view.php is the view layer for the block. All the blocks, every block that you add to a page of that type will use this view.php layer, unless you use a custom template. And custom templates are found within a templates directory. They are just PHP files in the same format as view.php, just named differently. So you can, once you duplicate them and rename them, you can make changes to them, and when you apply them, the changed template will be used instead of the first one. Auto.js is a way of automatically including JavaScript when you're adding or editing the template. That's not to be confused with the Vue.js that is included in the header of the page when a block is on that page. That's for presentation. Auto.js, named kind of strangely, it's named because it's automatically included, but it's only automatically included in add or edit mode. And we use it for validation, excuse me, but you can also use it for any block when in edit mode needs to do some interactive stuff. And I think that's about it. If there are no more questions, I think that's about the extent of the basic block training. I know there's a lot of info in there. There is some pretty good documentation on our site there's some pretty good documentation on our site for how to build your own block types. It's a problem that a fair amount of people, actually they find once they figure out what concrete5 can do in terms of how it's broken up. Developers and designers will frequently want to create their own block type. So we've tried to document that process in a number of different ways. Well, thanks everybody. I'm glad that you were able to take this. I'm not totally, I don't have the schedule in front of me. Um, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but the advanced block development class is coming up. Um, I hope this answered, a fair amount of questions and didn't, didn't just completely replace those questions with new questions. Um, if I encourage everyone interested to sign up on the advanced block development class. And if you have any, if you need a refresher on where some of these, um, if you find yourself working with this stuff down the line and you can't remember where a particular block, um, what particular block I showed for a particular example, just feel free to send a message to Julia or to Matt and or to me, and be happy to point you in the right direction. And and thanks for taking the training.